When I was a teenager, growing up with the specials of George Carlin, Bill Hicks, and Louis C.K., I originally wanted to be a comedian. I was inspired by their ability not only to make others laugh, but to analyze society. I thought comedians were a form of social thinker, whose insights helped civilization as a whole. At the same time, this appreciation caused me to explore philosophers in general, and this then sent me in a different direction, as I explored in another video. Arguably the greatest comedian of all time was George Carlin. While today he's the archetype of authenticity and character, it was a journey for him to get there. Carlin began his career as the hippy-dippy weatherman, performing in the style the 1950s culture expected of him. Though Carlin was of the older generation, in the 60s he came to identify with the new contrarian counterculture that was gaining force. In one interview, he said he had to make a life decision, to continue to compromise himself and his values and do what convention taught, or to venture off into the world of artistic integrity. Though the latter involved taking a risk, this was the path that he chose. Changing his appearance to meet the aesthetic of the beatnik generation, his simple, subdued dress expressed his values. With the outward appearance of a 50s poet, he showed his merit through his brilliance and skill in social observation. Like the archetype of a crow, Carlin embraced ill omen and misanthropy, and stood aloof from civilization as a social commentator. He used his acerbic wit and skill with language to reveal the foolishness of others. In his interviews, Carlin explained his creative process. He'd observe society and write his thoughts constantly. Then each year he would do a comedy circuit, trying his material out on audiences and refining it, until he was able to put together a new HBO special. Exploring topics like death, war, religion, sexuality, parenting, children, and censorship, Carlin pioneered the genre of black comedy. His conversational style built a close relationship with his audience, creating the sense they were getting to know him personally. Carlin also enjoyed exploring the niceties of language and its arbitrary rules. His most iconic bit was on the 7 Dirty Words, exploring the regulation of language and American culture. Though no centralized authority censored speech, American social mores policed what people could say. With 7 words like the 7 deadly sins, Carlin created an enduring commentary on the United States. Later making up a part of a Supreme Court case, Carlin's work helped open up the country's culture. Around 2008, at the time of George Carlin's death, American comedy reached its apogee. Under him, society accepted the idea of the supreme comic, a figure of universal appeal, who stood for realism and integrity. In this period, comedians stood for a specific set of values, all having had to fight to win free expression in their work. They were unambiguous opponents of censorship. They favored opening up the culture socially and breaking the residual moral rules placed on people from the last vestiges of organized religion. Beyond these principles, they stood for honesty, candor, and living a free life of authenticity. After Carlin's death, it appeared he could be succeeded by Louis C.K., who might embody the next generation of universal comedy. But following the disruption of Louis's public career, the idea that there could be a figure who could fill the same mantle as Carlin diminished, comedy fragmented, and ultimately lost a vision of the principles that had unified it in the prior decade. As the comedian stood victorious at the helm of American culture in 2008, we achieved an open society. However, now the further moral good the comedian could offer civilization started foundering. While oppressive religion and censorship were gone, people now wanted a principle they could use to organize themselves and give their lives meaning. The moralizers who had controlled society were overthrown, but in a world of liberty, people desired direction when everything was permitted. What made Carlin so successful was his understanding of the comedian's role in civilization. The comedian's purpose in a country like the United States is to be the source of self-awareness for society. The comedian reveals the illusions and fantasies believed in by the masses of people and promoted by powerful figures. In doing this, he helps society better conform itself to reality. If we go back to ancient Greece, Socrates would walk the agora in Athens, and under the divine mission he felt he had been given by the oracle, reveal the falsities and untruths subscribed to by the aristocracy. When he did this, he attracted many young supporters and provoked large amounts of laughter in his onlookers. He was so successful at what he did that the upper classes put him to death. During his trial, Socrates argued he was performing a social service, and instead of executing him, the state should give him a pension. This event shows that the comedian, if he's protected by law, plays an important role socially. As we said, in theory, a great comedian can become universally celebrated, transcending partisan categories through his appeal to truth as a principle. At the same time, we can affirm the difficulty of being a comedian in a free time. In the age of Carlin, there was the obvious battle to achieve a more libertarian culture. With the fight for individual freedom mostly won, today's struggle becomes one for purpose and meaning. Comedians are associated with American and British culture, as these countries have long traditions of constitutional protections. In America and England, comedians maintain social openness. Yet in authoritarian countries, comedians aren't able to exist. As Anglophone values have spread abroad, so too has the practice of comedy, slowly becoming a core part of Western culture. While stand-up comedy is a relatively modern phenomenon, there are examples of it from history that give us insight into it. In pre-modern societies like medieval Europe, monarchs often maintained court jesters who would entertain them and their guests. While you might think they would be limited to physical or prop comedy, some did venture into a world similar to stand-up, telling jokes and challenging power in a manner similar to Carlin. The most famous example of this is Will Sommers, the court fool of the King of England, Henry VIII. King Henry was famous during the Tudor period for breaking with the Catholic Church. He founded his own religion, the Church of England, so he could remarry in pursuit of a male heir. In a prior video, we mentioned this, the problem of succession and the pressure monarchs felt to prevent their dynasties from going extinct. After being married to Catherine of Aragon for years, Henry sought to annul the marriage. As the Pope was a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, Charles V, at the time of this request, it was denied. This led Henry to look to the Protestant faith on the continent to give him more authority in his own lands. The king kept the tenets of the Catholic religion, but his new Anglican faith made him the highest authority in his lands. This allowed Henry to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn, who would fail to give birth to a male heir, but produce one of England's greatest monarchs, the future Queen Elizabeth I. When Henry broke from the church, he upset traditional morality and the institutions the country had been founded on for generations, dating back to the reign of Alfred the Great. This caused many people of integrity to take an ethical stand against him. The most famous critic of the king was Thomas More, the king's chancellor who was put to death for failing to join the king in his schism. Other victims of Henry were Thomas Cromwell, his most adept minister, and John Houghton, one of the English monks who was put to death after the Carthusians failed to sanction the creation of his new faith. Not only these figures, but Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Anne Askew, and many others were executed under the reign of the king. While Henry had been a popular ruler in his youth, his obsession with siring a male heir completely unmade him mentally. He became an insecure and tyrannical king, embodying the shadow aspect of the ruler in masculine psychology. Still accepted as the rightful sovereign, after putting so many to death, he alienated his subjects and caused them to live in fear. Few were able to oppose him or offer him good counsel, especially after the execution of his wisest advisor, Cromwell. In this environment of living under a tyrant, You might think no one would be able to speak truth to power. Yet here is where comedy had one of its opportunities to shine. Under Henry VIII, the one person who was able to speak honestly to him was his jester, his court fool and entertainer, Will Somers. So ingratiated was Somers with the king that he was even included in some of his family portraits. Known for his sympathy for the poor and downtrodden, Somers also mocked Henry for his many wives and pointed out the wastefulness and indulgence of his court. Somers would sometimes go so far the king would stop him and threaten to put him to death. Despite this, he remained in the king's service and survived his reign, dying peacefully later under the rule of Elizabeth. Despite threatening him with death, Somers was one of the king's few companions. Late in life, when he was in poor health, the only one who was able to raise the king's spirits was his court fool. The story of Somers shows the unique role of the comedian. Patrice O'Neill, in one of his appearances with Jim Norton, explained something similar, how he would get along with hard criminals growing up by making them laugh. This shows the extraordinary power that a comedian has, as a transcendent figure, able to relate to anyone, and as a communicator of truth as well. In The Sopranos, Tony talks to his psychiatrist, Jennifer Melfi, about his youth and adolescence. Tony explores what he was like as a child before joining the mafia. He explains that he was a class clown, always laughing and making jokes, and after joining the mafia, tries to maintain the same persona with his cronies. Tony confides to Melfi that he sees himself as a sad fool, someone who puts on a face of happiness while feeling a sense of inner nihilism within. Similar to this is a sketch of Louis C.K., where he meets with the filmmaker David Lynch. In it, Lynch continually exhorts Louis with the expectation he perform something humorous. In his iconic cadence, Lynch keeps repeating, 1, 2, 3, funny, expecting Louis to make him laugh on command. Every time he does this, though, Louis just sits there looking depressed, answering simply, I'm not that kind of funny, making the scene increasingly uncomfortable and humorless. Here you get an insight into the nature of a comedian. A comedian is actually someone grappling with the unhappiness of being human. They're trying to be self-aware and make others laugh from their observations of tragedy. These anecdotes show the duality of the comedian. Often the best ones provoke laughter from others, while also confronting the experience of despair within. With this in mind, one might imagine an unhappy society could produce a great comedian. Eastern Europeans have an experience of tragedy that separates them from Westerners. This is a product of the region's history and geography. Without access to the waterways of Western Europe, with its rivers that discharge in the ocean, and its peninsulas that make maritime trade affordable, economic development was much slower in the East. While Western countries like Holland became affluent, abolished serfdom, and developed middle classes, countries like Poland and Hungary, based on vast river basins, remained agricultural and feudal. This resulted in the development of powerful aristocracies that impeded social mobility. While Poland had Copernicus and Hungary Matthias Corvinus, these brief golden ages were unmade by magnates who monopolized political power and prevented the state from developing a centralized government. Decision-making in these states became more and more impaired, until their whole apparatus came to exist simply to maintain the privileges of the elite. Not only that, but these countries experienced political turmoil, like the Mongol invasions, the conquests of the Turks, and in more recent decades, partition by totalitarian dictators. Due to this, there's a fatalism about Eastern European psychology. In a sense, it's a product of the hard determinism of geography. If a country is a vast plain without physical boundaries, surrounded by predatory neighbors, it will eventually fall to other powers. The fatalism of Eastern Europeans is, in a sense, a defense mechanism, an expression of realism, a response to the hard outcomes of life from the circumstances one is born into. With this in mind, it makes sense this environment might produce one of history's most famous comedians. Stanchik was a court fool for three kings of Poland in the early modern era. Like Henry's fool, he served the aristocracy, but had a sympathy for the lower classes. A ruminating and thoughtful figure, he corresponded with politicians and ministers. His sometimes subversive comedy would criticize the privileges of the magnates. A nationalist, he was concerned with Poland's defeat to the Muscovites. Their losing Smolensk in war was an event that would foreshadow the country's future dissolution. He also criticized the failure of the monarchy to fully subjugate Prussia, a wise insight, as the unvanquished state would reconstitute itself and reemerge later as one of the predatory powers that would partition Poland. After his death, Stanchik became an iconic figure, idealized by Polish nationalists who used his memory to support different intellectual and political causes. He came to embody the Cassandra archetype, a figure who would utter true prophecies that would never be believed by others. His spirit continued in the modern era, like when comedy was embraced by the Poles, stuck behind the Iron Curtain. Under communism, the spirit of comedy became essential as a safety valve, expressing the nihilism of life under Soviet rule, with the system failing economically and them unable to gain their independence by force. The fool plays an important role in the societies that allow him to exist. First, he's a transcendental figure, able to speak to the powerful directly due to his special position as an entertainer. His ability to make others laugh is a truly powerful skill that lets him ingratiate himself with those he'd otherwise have no connection to. Comedy is unique as it's based on the unexpected, and the unexpected telling of truth. When one does this, it reveals underlying realities, relieves tension, and provokes laughter. The comedian fulfills a vital role in civilization. Because of his unique role in society, he's able to impart philosophies that might not normally be accepted. In his highest form, he's a source of self-awareness for society, promoting freedom and revealing the falsehoods believed by the masses. He also exposes the hypocrisies of the powerful and reminds us of what's real. While not all comedians are philosophers, the most excellent are.